Reports in the German magazine Der Spiegel said that the German Chancellor had told the British Prime Minister limiting freedom of movement in the EU would be a point of no return. But Downing Street has insisted this morning that the Prime Minister remains determined to address the issue of immigration from within the EU. In Berlin today, a spokesman for Angela Merkel has stressed that the free movement of migrant workers within the European Union was not open to negotiation. Our correspondent in Berlin is Jenny Hill.
This article is proving to be pretty incendiary stuff. Now, it was published in Der Spiegel news magazine here in Germany. It quotes unnamed sources close to the Chancellor, and they've told the paper that Angela Merkel believes David Cameron is reaching a point of no return. The British Prime Minister, as we know, wants to limit or cap the number of EU migrants coming into the UK. According to this article, the Chancellor has said if he persists with those plans, she'll abandon efforts to keep Britain in the EU. Now, Angela Merkel's spokesperson has been downplaying the claims made in this article, but he did at a press conference early this morning clarify the Chancellor's position. He says that she's willing to negotiate on issues like benefit fraud, benefit tourism, but where she really won't budge is the principle of free movement of workers within the EU. That, as a principle, he said, is non-negotiable. Her spokesman's name is Stefan Seibert.
Es ist zunächst einmal Sache Großbritanniens, sich darüber klar zu werden, welche Rolle es künftig.
It's up to Britain to decide what role it wants to play in the European Union. It's not about bilateral relations between Britain and Germany, but about Britain and all the EU member states, with consequences for the whole of the European Union. We, the German government, want Britain to be engaged and to have an active role in a strong EU. Chancellor Merkel has stressed that very clearly in the past, such as in the British Parliament earlier this year. Therefore, we will continue to hold talks and work closely together where there are common interests.
And that's the kind of line you come to expect from Angela Merkel's people, who've said to me on numerous occasions they want Britain to stay in the EU. Angela Merkel, a politician known for her compromising attitude, she'll try and fix a problem like this, so you can expect work to be going on behind the scenes. And it's probably best summed up in the words of her spokesman this morning. Germany, he said to me, is working for a stronger Britain inside the EU.
Jenny Hill. Well, a report's been published today by Open Europe. That's a Eurosceptic think tank that calls for reform of the EU. And it says that there should be a new law introduced by Brussels that would mean benefits were only paid out when an EU migrant has lived in a new country for 3 years. Under the proposals, poorly paid workers from the European Union would no longer be able to claim wage top-ups like working tax credits, while their British counterparts could. Emma-Jane Kirby has been meeting Polish workers in West London.
A social gathering outside the Polish church in West London, where long-term residents welcome their newly arrived compatriots.
I do the building work. I work on my own.
Jarek arrived in the UK 4 years ago to work on a construction site. But because his wages were so low, he was eligible for a state top-up to boost his earnings. That money, called the working tax credit, is helping him, he says, to become self-sufficient and to set up his own successful building business.
I earn more and more every year, but I'm still eligible to some support.
Can I ask how much it is that you get per month or per week?
350 up to 4, maybe a month, something like that.
Jarek is perfectly entitled to claim working tax credit. European Union rules state that an EU migrant must have access to the same benefits as citizens of the host country. But a new report by a think tank which campaigns for radical reform of the EU says it's wrong that EU migrants can claim so many benefits in Britain. Stephen Booth is research director at Open Europe.
If an EU migrant is basically able to access all in-work benefits such as tax credits and so on as soon as they start working in the UK. And the issue is that in other countries, so France or Germany, there's a much higher threshold. The migrant will have to contribute much more before they're entitled to benefits.
Open Europe says the EU rules on welfare were set with countries like France, Germany, Poland and the Netherlands in mind, where welfare is mainly funded from individual and employers' contributions. In other words, if you haven't paid into the pot, you can't claim. But in Britain, benefits come out of general taxation rather than salary contributions. Stephen Booth from Open Europe proposes that EU migrants should not be allowed any access to in-work benefits for 3 years.
A national government should be able to set a 3-year exclusion period so that it takes 3 years to qualify for all benefits. It would actually have some impact on the numbers of people coming to the UK, and particularly the types of people coming to the UK, because it would effectively cut out that subsidy to come at a low-skilled level and reduce some of the incentive to migrate to come to do low-skilled jobs and low-income jobs.
But is that legal?
Well, this new system would require a change to the rules at the EU level. And I think it wouldn't be fundamentally at odds with the idea of free movement. It would still provide EU citizens with the right to seek work across Europe. It would just mean they wouldn't have the access to the welfare system for the first 3 years. But after those 3 years, when they've integrated into their new home, their new country, they would have access to welfare benefits.
At the Polish church, migrants see that suggestion as deeply unfair.
If we're paying taxes here, why shouldn't we get something back from the government?
If I have to pay the same amount of tax, why I haven't got the same right like the others? What should be different?
But once an EU migrant successfully claims working tax credit, it can also unlock access to a host of other benefits, like social housing and child tax credit, even if, like Sparek, your children don't live in Britain.
I was here alone and my family was in Poland, and I've been allowed to take a child benefit for them. In the UK, for children who stay in a native country. At that time, in Poland, it was maybe £20 a month. For 3 children in UK, I could get 4 times that money.
I think I see someone.
Monica, who only earns £1,100 a month, has so far been unsuccessful in claiming working tax credit. But she's furious that her colleague got it immediately.
My colleague just comes about 3 months ago, and she got benefits, and me not.
She's also from Poland?
Yes.
And how do you think she's managed?
She lied.
Do you think lots of people do that to get the benefits? They lie about their situation then?
Yeah, I think so. They lie. So they're cheating and cheating and all.
It's clear that some migrant workers do exploit working tax credit and all the other benefits it unlocks. We were told of one woman who answered an advertisement for a nanny, but who asked if her £12 an hour wages could be paid cash in hand, so she could still claim working tax credit and all the other benefits. When that request was rejected, she turned down the position, saying she'd lose out financially. Stephen Booth from Open Europe insists his 3-year moratorium would end such practices.
If they've got a family and children and so on, they can see their take-home pay almost doubled or even tripled in some cases through these top-ups from government. And I think it's unfair to suggest that national welfare systems should be used for that. But you should be able to treat your national citizens differently to a newly arrived EU migrant.
That report by Emma Jane Kirby. So what do immigration figures show about who comes to this country, what they come here for? Carlos Vargas Silva is a senior researcher with the Oxford Migration Observatory Centre.
The most recent data is for March 2014, and what we see for that period was 162,000 net migrants are from outside the EU, so they're coming from outside the EU, and for EU nationals is 131,000. So it is still the case that net migration from outside the EU is higher than net migration from within the EU.
But there has been an increase, hasn't there, in recent years from inside the European Union?
There has been a large increase in net migration from inside the European Union. The current value is double what it was a few years ago.
Why is that?
One of the reasons is the Eurozone crisis. So before, migrants from the old EU countries, those countries that were members of the European Union before 2004, were coming to the UK to study. Some were coming for work, some were coming for family reasons. Now, in recent years, because of the Eurozone crisis, there has been a large increase in migration for work reasons from the old EU countries to the UK, and that accounts for the large increase in net migration from the EU.
And is it possible to estimate how many of those are claiming?
Good data from the Department of Work and Pensions, and about 131,000 people that are EU nationals are actually claiming one type of working age benefits. The other type of things that they can claim in terms of tax credits is more complicated, and the data is not as readily available. Those are people who were EU nationals when they got their national insurance number. So some of those can be British national, but it's going to be a very small number, given that most people, when you come from the EU, you remain EU national.
Do you have a number for how many EU citizens live here altogether?
The latest estimate that we have made about the number of EU nationals living in the UK is about 2.8 million EU nationals living in the UK. And that is divided almost half and half between those from the old EU countries and those from the accession countries.
Carlos Vargas Silva. David Cameron's position has changed on the question of freedom of movement, the principle which is enshrined in the Treaty of Rome, which set up the common market. In March last year, he argued that the way of controlling immigration was by tackling the payment of benefits.
What we can do is make sure that those who come here from the EU or from further afield do so for the right reasons. That they come here because they want to contribute to our country, not because they're drawn by the attractiveness of our benefit system or by the opportunity to use our public services.
He then went on to say that the changes he wanted would be within the spirit of what national governments are able to do within Europe, while respecting the need to have the free movement of people, which is part of the single market. But in recent months, the Prime Minister seems to have been questioning that very principle. He had this to say in his conference speech in October, when he warned about
numbers that have increased faster than we in this country wanted, and at a level that was too much for our communities and for our labour markets. All of this has to change, and it will be at the very heart of my renegotiation strategy for Europe. Britain, I know you want this sorted. So I will go to Brussels, I will not take no for an answer, and when it comes to free movement, I will get what Britain needs.
And a series of briefings since then suggests that the PM will be taking an even tougher line in a major speech on immigration before Christmas. So would just curbing in-work benefits on its own be enough to appease Eurosceptic backbenchers? The Conservative MP Nigel Mills sits on the Commons Work and Pensions Committee. Last year he tried without success to stop the recent lifting of restrictions on Bulgarians and Romanians coming to the UK.
It's not like there's an absolute principle that if you're in the EU, your citizens have to get a right to free movement here.
Well, hang on. I mean, this is a principle enshrined in the Treaty of Rome, which set up the common market in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we do need to change that freedom. I think the Treaty of Rome was created when there were a handful of nations of equivalent wealth.
So if David Cameron comes to the Conservative Party and says, look, I've managed to negotiate a fantastic deal, which is about freedom of movement to claim benefits, we're going to curb that, what kind of reaction do you think there would be amongst your fellow MPs?
That would deter some people from coming from within the EU. But I think that the question we really have is, I think when you see lots of Poles coming, for example, they seem to be a lot of single men coming here to work, to send money back home. I don't think they were coming here purely to claim welfare, or even mainly to claim welfare. They were coming here for the higher wages and living standards that this country provides. And so I'm not sure how many people you will deter by having stricter welfare rules.
So if David Cameron purely focuses on welfare reform as an answer to the migration question, do you think he would face a sizable revolt from his own backbenchers? I
sense the welfare changes, to the extent that they're achievable and can be agreed and would take us some of the way forward, I still suspect they're quite tricky under EU law, because you'd be basically giving different welfare to a French person than a British one, which I suspect would contravene the treaties as they stand anyway. But I think when people are weighing up whether to vote in or out in a referendum, there probably are two questions. One, is our democratic parliament sovereign? And two, is have we got control of our borders so we can act in our own national interest?
Nigel Mills. Well, Ian Duncan-Smith is the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions. I asked him whether he thought that Britain's welfare system was a draw for would-be migrants.
Before, it was pretty much an open door. You could come in, you could be out of work, you could claim benefits. There was a very poor test, and you could also get housing benefit. Now, by Monday next week, we'll have tightened it even further, but it will be basically you arrive, you have to demonstrate in the 3 months that you're here that you are genuinely seeking work and that you are qualified to seek work. And if you are, and then you are out of work while seeking work, you can claim for only 3 months. And at the end of that 3 months, you'll be asked to leave. It's also worth reflecting on the fact that when universal credit comes in and it starts rolling out nationally next year, it's even tighter on 2 counts. And that will include, of course, the area that we talk about as tax credits, because what will happen is you won't be able to claim benefits unemployed. And secondly, if you're not accompanied by your children, there won't be any payments going across as there are under the existing rules.
Do you think there's scope for tightening it still further, though, when you've been having these discussions with European colleagues? What about the idea from Open Europe to make people wait 3 years before they could claim tax credits?
Well, actually, these are proposals that this government, myself particularly, has been putting forward. So I've been in discussion with a number of people from my counterparts in Germany, Spain, even France, Holland, Denmark. I've talked to all of them on a number of occasions over the last 2.5 years, and they all pretty much agree that essentially the system's gone wrong and that countries should be able to insist on some form of contribution for a period of time. It's just that which has not been finally agreed. So, the question is really how do we do that? And most of that can be done, obviously, by changing the regulations and the rules within the existing agreements, and that if the countries agree to do that, which many of them, as I say, already have agreed in principle. So what they're asking us to do, we're already, the government, Prime Minister and myself, have actually been already pressing on others and getting a remarkable degree of agreement. And in fact, even Mrs. Merkel agreed with that categorically when she said the EU is not a social union and there cannot be de facto immigration into other EU systems. So she was robust about that, and we are in agreement with her. So
to be clear, I understand that a final figure hasn't been agreed, but a time scale of 2 to 3 years is something that's very much on the table.
It is, and all the countries are discussing it. Some, in principle, do some of that already, and it's a matter of saying to the Commission the countries have the right to set this requirement within certain limits.
But do you think just focusing on the welfare system will be enough to allay people's concerns about immigration? One of your Conservative colleagues, Nigel Mills, I've just been talking to, says that actually what people are worried about are the sheer numbers and things like pressure on public services.
Well, of course, all of those things have been discussed, but the Prime Minister will be making a speech, and so I suggest that we all wait for him to lay out exactly what his position and the government's position will be in terms of the renegotiation. He means business, and they know that.
But in very broad terms, would you agree that it's the principle of freedom of movement that needs to be looked at?
Look, I'm not going to speculate on where we need to be. All I know is that the work that we've done is to get rid of the pull factor. The Prime Minister has always made it clear that there are limits in all of this, but I wouldn't get engaged in a debate about principles. I always think to myself, when people start debating principles, what actually happens is they lose the reality of what's happening on the ground.
But we're getting stern warnings from Germany that by broaching the idea of looking at the principle of freedom of movement, we're reaching a point of no return.
Do you know what? I've been around in politics long enough, Arthur, to know not to speculate on the speculation about someone else's speculation. In a magazine that most people in Britain don't read, we hear that somebody thinks that somebody else said something to someone at some point, at some time, and nobody quite knows who that was. So you'll forgive me if I take a self-denying ordinance and simply say I deal with the facts. And the facts are very simple, that the Prime Minister has been, and I have been, and others have been in discussion with the member governments of the European Union about restricting access to benefits. So you'll find there's an awful lot of agreement about there being a problem out there, and I'm just not keen to dwell on what people say might happen. I always think you make the weather, you don't wait for somebody to speculate about what it might be if nobody is there at the time when they were meant to be, if you follow what I'm saying.
Well, let me tell you what the Prime Minister's already said about it, which he's talked in his conference speech. He warned about numbers that have increased faster than we in this country wanted, at a level that was too much for my communities. I know you want this sorted, so I'll go to Brussels. I will not take no for an answer. And when it comes to free movement, I will get what Britain needs.
Well, as I say, let's wait for the Prime Minister to set out what his position will be, and I understand he is going to make a speech about that. So rather than speculate about what people say Mrs. Merkel said, as I gave you a quote earlier on saying she is very strong and very tough, about people moving from one country to another to get a better deal over social security and welfare in general. And the Prime Minister has been very clear about him wanting to make sure that Britain has controlled immigration. At the end of the day, if you look at what we've done, we've reduced net from abroad dramatically, and it's his job as Prime Minister to set out those terms, and we'll get that eventually. So I'm quite happy to wait for that.
Ian Duncan Smith.